The sound of a lone shovel striking hard earth echoed through the Wyoming valley as Thomas Tucker dug the final resting place for his beloved wife, his tears mixing with the soil of their homestead. It was April 1875, but spring had not yet come to Thomas's heart, and he doubted it ever would. The Blackfoot River gurgled nearby, its waters cold and clear, a stark contrast to the murky depths of his grief. At 32, Thomas had never imagined burying Abigail at 29. They'd had 10 good years together, years filled with laughter and struggles, hopes and disappointments, and most painful of all, the promise of children that never came to be. Their small ranch, tucked away in the shadow of the Wind River Range, had been their dream. They'd named it Tucker's Rest, though rest was the furthest thing from Thomas's mind as he continued to dig, his calloused hands gripping the wooden handle of the shovel until his knuckles turned white. "Should have been me," he muttered, pausing to wipe sweat from his brow despite the chill in the air. The influenza had swept through their community like wildfire, taking Abigail in just 5 days. Thomas had watched helplessly as the fever consumed her, stealing the light from her eyes and the warmth from her skin. When the hole was deep enough, Thomas climbed out and walked to the small wagon where Abigail lay, wrapped in their wedding quilt, the one her mother had helped her stitch with patterns of mountains and rivers, symbols of their life together in the West. He stood there for a long moment, his broad shoulders slumped, his face lined with grief beneath his weathered Stetson. "I'm sorry, Abby," he whispered, carefully lifting her body. She felt so light in his arms, as if all that had made her Abigail had already floated away, leaving only a shell behind. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you." Thomas placed her gently in the grave, his hands lingering on the quilt. Then he removed his hat and knelt beside the open earth, his prayers little more than broken sounds carried away by the wind. When he could delay no longer, he began the terrible task of returning the soil to the grave, each shovelful like a weight on his own chest. He marked the spot with a wooden cross he'd carved himself, her name and the dates of her short life etched into the surface. Thomas had chosen this spot because Abigail had loved to sit by the river in the evenings, watching the sunset paint the water gold. She'd always said it was where she felt most at peace. "You rest now, Abby," he said, his voice breaking as he placed a handful of early wildflowers at the base of the cross. "I'll be along when my time comes." The days that followed passed in a fog. Thomas went through the motions of caring for the small herd of cattle and the few horses in the corral, but his heart wasn't in it. He'd sit by Abigail's grave each evening, sometimes talking to her about the day, sometimes saying nothing at all. The neighboring ranchers and their wives brought food and offers of help, but Thomas turned most away, preferring his solitude and his grief. Spring advanced around him, but Thomas took no notice of the new grass sprouting or the buds forming on the cottonwood trees. Inside the small cabin he and Abigail had built together, everything remained as she had left it. Her clothes still hung on pegs by the door, her hairbrush still lay on the small table by their bed. Thomas slept on a bedroll on the floor, unable to bear lying in the bed they'd shared. One morning in early May, as Thomas was mending a fence line far from the cabin, he spotted a rider approaching from the direction of town. The stranger rode a handsome palomino and led a pack mule loaded with supplies. Thomas straightened, his hand instinctively moving to the revolver on his hip. The rider raised a hand in greeting as she approached, for Thomas could now see it was a woman, her golden hair peeking out from beneath a wide-brimmed hat. She wore men's clothing, practical for riding, but there was no mistaking her feminine features as she drew closer. "Good morning," she called, her voice clear and strong. "I'm looking for the Campbell place. Am I anywhere near it?" Thomas squinted against the sun. "You've overshot by about 5 miles, madam. It's back the way you came, over that ridge to the east." The woman sighed and pushed back her hat. "I was afraid of that. Old man Webster in town gave me directions, but he seemed more interested in his whiskey than in being helpful." Despite himself, Thomas felt the ghost of a smile touch his lips. That sounds like Webster. You're welcome to water your horses at my stream before heading back. I'd appreciate that, Mr. Tucker, Thomas Tucker. Annabeth Stewart, she replied with a nod. I've come from Denver to help my uncle with his ranch for a spell. My aunt passed last winter and he's not doing so well on his own. Thomas stiffened at the mention of loss but gestured toward the stream. This way. As they walked, leading her horses, Annabeth glanced at his face. I've put my foot in it, haven't I? You've suffered a loss too, I can see it in your eyes. Thomas was taken aback by her directness. Most people danced around his grief, offering platitudes or avoiding the subject altogether. My wife, he said simply. 2 months ago, Annabeth nodded, not offering condolences or questions. The early days are the hardest, like walking through deep snow where every step feels impossible. There was something in her tone that told Thomas she spoke from experience. He found himself curious, despite his determination to remain detached from the world. At the stream, Annabeth removed her hat completely, revealing a face that was striking rather than conventionally beautiful. Her features were strong, her eyes a deep green that reminded Thomas of the forest after rain. She had a small scar above her right eyebrow, and her skin was tanned from outdoor living. How far is it to my uncle's place? She asked as her horses drank. About 2 hours' ride, but there's a storm coming, Thomas said, nodding toward dark clouds gathering in the west. Those Wyoming storms can hit hard and fast. You might want to wait it out. Annabeth looked at the sky, then at Thomas. I wouldn't want to impose. It's no imposition, Thomas replied, surprised to find he meant it. You can shelter in the barn if you prefer. I don't have much by way of hospitality these days. Annabeth studied him for a moment. I understand. The barn will be fine, thank you. By the time they reached Tucker's Rest, the wind had picked up, driving before it the scent of rain. Thomas showed Annabeth to the barn, a sturdy structure built of logs and roofed with split shingles. There's clean straw in the loft, he said. And you're welcome to any supplies you need for your animals. You're kind, Mr. Tucker, Annabeth said, beginning to unload her mule. I won't forget it. Thomas hesitated, then said, I'll bring you some food when it's ready. Back in the cabin, Thomas found himself tidying up for the first time in weeks. He built up the fire in the small iron stove and put together a simple meal of beans, salt pork, and cornbread left by a neighbor's wife. As he worked, he glanced occasionally at Abigail's things, feeling a twist of guilt for having a woman on his property who wasn't his wife. It's not like that, Abby, he murmured. She's just passing through. When the rain began to fall, a heavy deluge that drummed on the cabin roof, Thomas gathered the food onto a tray and headed to the barn. He found Annabeth in the loft, sitting cross-legged on a blanket spread over the straw, writing in a small leather-bound journal by the light of a lantern. I thought you might be hungry, he said, suddenly awkward. Annabeth closed her journal and smiled. Starving, actually, thank you. She accepted the tray, then asked, would you care to join me? I've been talking to horses all day, and while they're excellent listeners, their conversation skills leave something to be desired. Thomas hesitated, then climbed the rest of the way up the ladder and sat on a bale of hay across from her. He'd brought enough food for two, though he hadn't acknowledged to himself that he might share the meal. Your place is beautiful, Annabeth said, breaking the cornbread. How long have you been here? 10 years. Abby and I came out after the war. I was with the Union cavalry, and I'd had enough of fighting. We wanted a fresh start. And you found it here, Thomas nodded, looking toward the small window where rain streamed down the glass. It wasn't easy at first. The winters are harsh, and we had to learn everything the hard way. But we were building something good. Annabeth ate quietly for a moment, then said, My husband fought for the Union too. He didn't come home. Thomas looked up sharply. I'm sorry, she shrugged, though her eyes held old pain. It was a long time ago. I was 19 when he left, 21 when I got the letter saying he'd fallen at Petersburg. I've had 8 years to learn to live with it. Does it get easier? The question slipped out before Thomas could stop it. Not easier, Annabeth said carefully. Just different. At first, grief is like a wild animal tearing at you constantly. Later, it becomes more like a companion that walks beside you. Sometimes it's quiet, and sometimes it roars again, but it's always there. Thomas found himself nodding, understanding exactly what she meant. They ate in companionable silence for a while, listening to the rain and the occasional whicker of the horses below. "How did you end up in Denver?" Thomas asked eventually. "I went to live with my brother after Jack died. He had a boarding house there. I helped run it until he remarried and his wife wanted to take over. Then I worked as a schoolteacher for a while." She smiled wryly. "I've tried my hand at a lot of things over the years. And now you're going to be a rancher." Annabeth laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to brighten the dim loft. "I doubt Uncle Campbell will let me do much actual ranching. He probably expects me to cook and clean and keep the books. But I've always loved horses, and I'm a fair hand with them." As they talked, Thomas realized it was the longest conversation he'd had with anyone since Abigail's death. There was something about Annabeth's straightforward manner and her own experience with loss that made it easier to speak with her than with neighbors who had known Abigail and whose eyes held pity whenever they looked at him. The storm continued into the evening, and Thomas found himself reluctant to return to his empty cabin. They talked of trivial things, the difficulties of keeping chickens safe from foxes, the best way to break a young horse, the merits of different cattle breeds. When Thomas finally left, carrying the empty tray, he felt lighter than he had in months. "Thank you for the meal and the company, Mr. Tucker," Annabeth said from the top of the ladder. "Thomas," he corrected. "And you're welcome, Miss Stewart." "Annabeth," she replied with a small smile. "Good night, Thomas." In the morning, Thomas woke before dawn as usual, but for the first time since Abigail's death, he didn't immediately feel the crushing weight of grief. It was still there, but somehow muted, as if his conversation with Annabeth had temporarily lifted some of the burden. He went about his morning chores, feeding the livestock and checking for any damage from the storm. When he reached the barn, he found Annabeth already up and grooming her palomino. "Good morning," she said, looking up with a smile. "I hope you don't mind, but I fed your horses along with mine." They seemed eager for breakfast. "I appreciate it," Thomas replied, noticing that she'd also swept the barn floor and organized some tools that had been left scattered about. "I should be on my way soon," Annabeth said, running a brush down her horse's flank. "I don't want Uncle Campbell to worry, though I'm not sure he even remembers I'm coming." Thomas nodded, feeling an unexpected pang at the thought of her leaving. "There's coffee and biscuits in the cabin if you'd like some before you go." Annabeth looked surprised by the invitation, but accepted with a nod. "That would be welcome, thank you." As they walked toward the cabin, Thomas glanced toward the river where Abigail's grave lay, marked by the wooden cross and surrounded now by spring wildflowers. Annabeth followed his gaze and stopped. "Is that where she rests?" she asked quietly. Thomas nodded, unable to speak for a moment. "It's a beautiful spot," Annabeth said. "May I pay my respects before we go in?" Thomas hesitated, then nodded again. No one besides himself had visited Abigail's grave yet. He'd been fiercely protective of it, as if it were his last connection to her. But something about Annabeth's quiet understanding made him willing to share this sacred space. They walked together to the riverside. The morning sun glinted off the water, and birds sang in the cottonwoods that lined the bank. Annabeth stood quietly by the grave for a moment, then knelt and placed a small wildflower beside the ones Thomas had left. "What was she like?" Annabeth asked softly. "She was." Thomas began, then paused, searching for words. "She was kind, always seeing the best in people. She loved to sing, though she claimed she couldn't carry a tune in a bucket." He smiled faintly at the memory. "She was stubborn, too. Once she set her mind on something, there was no changing it. That's how we ended up here. She'd read about Wyoming territory in a magazine and decided this was where we belonged." "She sounds like a remarkable woman," Annabeth said. "She was," Thomas agreed. "Better than I deserved." Annabeth stood up, brushing dirt from her knees. I doubt she would have agreed with that assessment. Inside the cabin, Thomas poured coffee while Annabeth looked around, taking in the small but well-made furniture and the feminine touches that still remained: a crocheted doily on the table, curtains at the windows, a quilt folded neatly at the foot of the bed that Thomas still couldn't bring himself to sleep in. "You built this place yourselves?" Annabeth asked, running her hand along the smooth surface of the table. "Most of it," Thomas replied, though Abby insisted on ordering the iron stove from back east, said she couldn't make a proper pie in a fireplace oven. Annabeth smiled. She was right about that. She accepted the cup of coffee Thomas offered and sat at the table. "You have a good life here, Thomas. Hard, I'm sure, but good." Thomas sat across from her, cradling his own cup. "Had," he corrected, "without Abby." Annabeth met his gaze steadily. "The life is still here. The land, the animals, the home you built together. She would want you to continue, wouldn't she?" Thomas looked away. "I'm trying. Some days are better than others." "That's all any of us can do," Annabeth said gently. After breakfast, Thomas helped Annabeth pack her supplies onto the mule and gave her clearer directions to the Campbell ranch. As she mounted her palomino, she looked down at him with those forest green eyes. "Thank you for the shelter and the kindness, Thomas Tucker. I hope our paths cross again." "They're bound to," Thomas replied. "Not many folks out this way. Everyone knows everyone else's business sooner or later." Annabeth laughed. "I've heard that about small communities." "Well then, until next time." Thomas watched her ride away, a strange mix of emotions stirring within him. For the first time since burying Abigail, he'd connected with another person. It left him feeling both guilty and relieved, as if he'd betrayed his wife by beginning to emerge from his cocoon of grief, yet also taken a necessary step toward healing. That evening he sat by Abigail's grave as usual, but this time he found himself talking about Annabeth. "You would have liked her, Abby," he said softly. "She's straightforward like you always were, no nonsense." He sighed, running his hand over the earth that covered his wife. "I miss you every minute of every day. I don't know how to do this without you." The weeks that followed fell into a familiar pattern. Thomas worked from sunup to sundown, caring for his small ranch, making repairs that had been neglected during the worst of his grief, and visiting Abigail's grave each evening. But now there was a subtle difference. He found himself looking toward the east sometimes, wondering about Annabeth and how she was faring with her uncle. In early June, Thomas needed supplies from town. He'd avoided going for months, sending neighbors with lists when necessary, but he could put it off no longer. He hitched the wagon early one morning and set out for the small settlement of Riverton, a half-day's journey from Tucker's Rest. The town was busier than usual, with several wagons lining the muddy main street. Thomas tied his team outside the general store and steeled himself for the inevitable condolences and curious looks from the townspeople. He'd hardly set foot inside when Mrs. Webster, the shopkeeper's wife, hurried over. "Thomas Tucker, as I live and breathe. We'd about given you up for dead out there." Thomas removed his hat politely. "Just busy with the ranch, Mrs. Webster." "Well, it's good to see you up and about. We've all been worried sick, especially after." She trailed off, her expression turning sorrowful. "Abigail was such a dear. We miss her terribly at the church quilting bees." Thomas nodded stiffly, unable to speak past the sudden lump in his throat. "Now, what can I get for you today?" Mrs. Webster asked, clearly sensing his discomfort and changing the subject. Thomas handed her the list he'd prepared, and she bustled off to gather the items. As he waited, looking out the store window at the dusty street, he caught sight of a familiar figure. Annabeth was exiting the bank across the way, dressed in a simple blue calico dress rather than the riding clothes she'd worn when they met. Her golden hair was pinned up beneath a modest bonnet, but there was no mistaking her confident stride. Before Thomas could decide whether to call out to her, the door to the general store opened and Annabeth herself walked in. She stopped short when she saw him, her face breaking into a warm smile. Thomas, what a pleasant surprise. Annabeth, he replied, suddenly aware of his trail, dusty clothes and unshaven face. I didn't expect to see you in town. Uncle Campbell needed medicine, and I volunteered to come fetch it. Plus, I confess I was getting a bit stir-crazy out at the ranch. She glanced around the store, lowering her voice. Between you and me, my uncle is a difficult man. Grief hasn't softened his edges, it's only made them sharper. Thomas nodded in understanding. Some men are like that. How are you settling in? Well enough. The ranch hands were skeptical of me at first, but I've won most of them over. Except for the foreman, Mr. Ritter. He seems determined to dislike me on principle. Jeb Ritter's been running that ranch for years, Thomas said. He probably sees you as a threat to his authority. That's exactly it, Annabeth agreed. Especially since Uncle Campbell has me keeping the books now, I discovered some discrepancies in the accounts. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Ritter's been skimming. I can't prove it yet, but the numbers don't add up, she sighed. It makes for an uncomfortable situation, but enough about my troubles. How have you been, Thomas? Before he could answer, Mrs. Webster returned with his supplies, her curious gaze darting between him and Annabeth. I see you've met Miss Stewart, she said, a hint of speculation in her voice that made Thomas inwardly cringe. We met when she first arrived in the area, Thomas explained. She got caught in a storm and sheltered at my place overnight, Mrs. Webster's eyebrows shot up, and Thomas immediately regretted his choice of words. In the barn, Annabeth clarified smoothly. Mr. Tucker was kind enough to offer shelter for my horses and myself when I got lost on the way to my uncle's ranch. How fortunate for you, Mrs. Webster said, her tone suggesting she didn't entirely believe their innocent explanation. Well, Thomas, that'll be $4.75 for your supplies. Thomas paid and gathered his purchases, conscious of the shopkeeper's watchful eye. I should be heading back, he said to Annabeth. It was good to see you. You as well, Annabeth replied. Perhaps I'll ride over to check on that mare we discussed sometime soon. Thomas was momentarily confused, then realized she was creating a pretext for a future visit that would sound innocent to Mrs. Webster's ears. Any time, he said. She should be foaling within the month. Outside the store, as Thomas loaded his supplies into the wagon, Annabeth approached him again. I apologize for that bit of fiction, she said quietly, but Mrs. Webster was looking at us like a hawk eyeing two field mice. Thomas smiled despite himself. It's all right. Small towns run on gossip, and I'd rather not be the main course at Sunday dinner conversations. Annabeth nodded in understanding. Still, I would like to visit sometime if that's all right. I've found myself thinking about our conversations. Thomas was surprised by her candor but found himself oddly pleased. I'd welcome the company, he said honestly. Good, I'll ride over next week if I can get away. She glanced over her shoulder at the town's small clinic. I should get Uncle's medicine. Safe travels, Thomas. As Thomas drove home, his mind was filled with thoughts of Annabeth, her directness, her resilience, the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled. For the first time since Abigail's death, he found himself looking forward to something. The realization brought both guilt and a tentative hope, emotions so tangled that he wasn't sure how to separate them. When he reached Tucker's Rest, he went straight to Abigail's grave, as he always did after being away. I saw her again, Abby, he said softly, arranging fresh wildflowers on the grave. Annabeth Stewart and I find myself wanting to know her better, he sighed, running a hand over his face. Is that wrong? It feels like I'm betraying you somehow. The river gurgled beside him, its constant flow a reminder of how life continued, regardless of human grief. A breeze rustled the cottonwood leaves overhead, and for a moment, Thomas could almost imagine it was Abigail's gentle touch on his cheek. I'll always love you, he whispered. Nothing will ever change that. The week passed slowly, with Thomas finding himself glancing often toward the road that led from the Campbell ranch. He told himself it was foolish to be watching for Annabeth, that she might have only been being polite when she mentioned visiting. But on Thursday afternoon, as Thomas was mending a saddle on the porch, he spotted a rider approaching Annabeth on her palomino. He set aside his work and stood, suddenly nervous. He'd bathed that morning and trimmed his beard, but he still felt rough and unkempt compared to most men. Years of outdoor work had weathered his face, and though he was only 32, sometimes he felt much older. Annabeth waved as she approached, her face alight with a smile that eased some of Thomas's tension. She wore a split-riding skirt and a blue blouse, her hair braided and tucked under a wide-brimmed hat. "Good afternoon, Thomas," she called as she reined in her horse. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," he replied, stepping forward to help her dismount. "I was just doing some repairs." As Annabeth swung down from her saddle, Thomas was struck again by her self-sufficiency. She moved with the confidence of a woman accustomed to handling herself in all situations, yet there was a natural grace to her movements that was undeniably feminine. "How's your uncle?" Thomas asked as he led her horse to the water trough. "Much the same," Annabeth replied with a small sigh. "The medicine helps his chest, but there's little to be done for his temper. Today he was well enough to argue with me about selling off some of the herd early, so I took that as a sign he didn't need my hovering and decided to ride out." Thomas smiled. "And you just happened to ride in this direction?" Annabeth met his gaze directly. "I went where I wanted to go." I've never been one for pretending otherwise. Her honesty was refreshing, and Thomas found himself relaxing. "Would you like some coffee, or I could make tea if you prefer?" "Coffee would be wonderful," Annabeth said, "and then perhaps you could show me around your ranch." "I've only seen the barn and cabin." As Thomas prepared the coffee inside, he was acutely aware of Annabeth exploring the small cabin, examining the few books on the shelf, the photographs in simple frames, the quilt on the bed that still remained untouched. "You made this furniture yourself, didn't you?" she asked, running her hand along the back of a rocking chair. "Most of it," Thomas replied, setting 2 cups on the table. "I used to be a carpenter's apprentice before the war. Those skills came in handy out here." "It's beautiful work," Annabeth said sincerely, joining him at the table. "You have a gift, Thomas." They sat together, drinking coffee and talking easily about ranch life, the challenges of the coming summer, and the latest news from town. Thomas found himself laughing at Annabeth's wry observations about the local characters, something he hadn't done in months. Afterward, Thomas showed her around Tucker's Rest, the small but sturdy corral where he broke horses, the cattle pastures that stretched toward the mountains, the vegetable garden that Abigail had started and that Thomas still maintained, though less successfully than his wife had. "You've done well here," Annabeth said as they walked back toward the cabin. "Built something real and lasting." "Abby and I did," Thomas corrected gently. "I'm just trying to hold it together now." Annabeth stopped, turning to face him fully. "Do you think she'd want you to just hold it together? Or would she want you to keep building, keep growing, keep living?" Thomas was taken aback by the question. I don't know if I can, not without her." "You can," Annabeth said firmly. "You already are, even if you don't see it. The fact that you're still here, still working this land, still caring for the animals, that's living, Thomas. It may not feel like it yet, but it is." Her words struck something deep within him, a truth he'd been avoiding. He had been living, going through the motions at first, but gradually finding purpose again in the daily rhythms of ranch life. "Thank you," he said simply, unable to articulate the complex emotions her words had stirred. Annabeth seemed to understand. She smiled and gestured toward the river. "Would you mind if I visited her grave again? I brought something." Thomas nodded, curious, and they walked together to the riverside where Abigail rested. Annabeth knelt by the wooden cross and removed from her pocket a small pouch. From it, she took a handful of seeds. "These are wildflower seeds," she explained, gently pressing them into the earth around the grave. "My mother taught me that flowers are messages from those we've lost, reminders that beauty returns even after the harshest winter." She looked up at Thomas. "I thought Abigail might like having her own little garden here." Thomas was moved by the gesture, so thoughtful and somehow so fitting for his Abby, who had loved growing things. "That's very kind," he managed to say, his voice rough with emotion. Annabeth stood, brushing dirt from her hands. "It's not kindness, it's respect for the woman who helped shape the man you are." They stood together beside the river for a long moment, the afternoon sun warm on their shoulders, the water flowing endlessly past. Thomas felt something shift within him, as if a door long closed had opened just a crack, letting in a sliver of light. "Will you stay for supper?" he asked suddenly. "I'm no great cook, but I can manage a decent stew." Annabeth's smile was answer enough. Over the weeks that followed, Annabeth visited regularly, usually bringing something with her fresh bread she'd baked, books from her uncle's library, news from town. Each visit seemed to bring a little more color back into Thomas's world. They developed a comfortable routine, often working together on whatever task needed doing around the ranch, talking easily or sharing comfortable silences. Sometimes they rode out to check on Thomas's cattle or to explore the beautiful country surrounding Tucker's Rest. Annabeth proved to be an excellent horsewoman, as at home in the saddle as any man Thomas had known. She had a way with animals that spoke of patience and understanding, qualities that extended to her interactions with Thomas himself. One evening in late June, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold, Annabeth mentioned that her uncle was selling off part of his herd. "He's not well enough to manage the full operation anymore," she explained, "and some of the hands have moved on. Jeb Ritter finally quit when I confronted him about the missing funds." "That couldn't have been easy," Thomas remarked, remembering the formidable foreman. "It wasn't," Annabeth admitted, "but Uncle Campbell backed me, which surprised us both. I think he was more aware of Ritter's thieving than he let on." "What will happen to the ranch now?" Annabeth sighed, looking out at the darkening landscape. "That's the question, isn't it? Uncle has no children, and I'm his only living relative. He's hinted that he means to leave it to me, but I'm not sure that's what I want." Thomas looked at her in surprise. "Most people would jump at the chance to own a spread like the Campbell Ranch." "I'm not most people," Annabeth said with a small smile. "And while I've come to enjoy ranch life more than I expected, I don't know if I want to take on that responsibility alone." She hesitated, then added softly, "Besides, I've grown fond of this valley and its inhabitants." Her words hung in the air between them, laden with meaning. Thomas felt his heart quicken. Over these weeks, his feelings for Annabeth had grown deeper than he'd been willing to admit, even to himself. He admired her strength, her honesty, her quiet compassion. He enjoyed her company more than he'd enjoyed anything since Abigail's death. But along with those feelings came guilt, a sense that he was somehow betraying his wife by opening his heart to another woman. Each night, he still visited Abigail's grave, talking to her about his day, including the parts that involved Annabeth. It was as if he needed Abigail's permission to move forward, yet didn't know how to ask for it. "Annabeth," he began hesitantly, But before he could find the words, they were interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Thomas stood, peering into the gathering darkness. 3 riders were coming up the road at a rapid pace, unusual for this time of evening. "Are you expecting company?" Annabeth asked, rising to stand beside him. "No," Thomas replied, his hand instinctively moving toward the rifle he kept by the door. "Stay here." He stepped off the porch, rifle in hand, and called out, "Who's there?" "Thomas, it's Frank Campbell," came the reply. "I need help. Annabeth's with you, isn't she?" Annabeth hurried forward at the sound of her uncle's voice. "Uncle Frank, what's wrong?" The 3 riders pulled up in front of the cabin. In the fading light, Thomas could see that Campbell looked haggard, his face pale beneath his gray beard. With him were 2 of his ranch hands, both armed and looking grim. "Rustlers hit the south pasture," Campbell explained, his voice raspy with his chronic illness. "They've taken at least 30 head, maybe more. We're gathering men to go after them." "When did this happen?" Thomas asked, already mentally cataloging what he would need for a pursuit. "Just before sundown, Miguel here spotted them driving the cattle toward the mountains. Campbell looked at his niece. Annabeth, I want you to stay here at Tucker's place. It's not safe back at our ranch right now. I can help track them, Annabeth protested. I'm as good a rider as any of your hands. No, Campbell said firmly. This isn't some cattle drive. These men are dangerous. They shot at Miguel when he spotted them. He turned to Thomas. Will you join us? We could use another good man. Thomas glanced at Annabeth, then nodded. Give me 5 minutes to gather my gear. Inside the cabin, as Thomas quickly packed supplies and checked his weapons, Annabeth followed, her expression torn between worry and frustration. I should be going too, she said. Those are our cattle. Your uncle's right, Thomas replied, buckling on his gun belt. These rustlers won't hesitate to shoot, and someone needs to stay here in case they circle back this way. Annabeth frowned but nodded reluctantly. Be careful, Thomas, don't take unnecessary risks. Thomas paused in his preparations, struck by the concern in her voice. For a moment they simply looked at each other, so much unspoken between them. I'll come back, he promised softly. Then, in a gesture that surprised them both, he leaned forward and gently kissed her cheek. Annabeth's eyes widened, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she placed a hand on his arm, squeezing gently. See that you do, she whispered. Outside, Thomas quickly saddled his best horse, a sturdy bay gelding that had the stamina for a long chase. As he mounted up, Campbell gave him a knowing look but said nothing about Annabeth, who stood on the porch watching them prepare to leave. We'll head for Blackfoot Pass, Campbell said. If they're smart, that's where they'll take the herd. It's the quickest route out of the territory. Thomas nodded. I know a shortcut that might let us get ahead of them. It's rough country, but it could save us hours. Lead on then, Campbell said, gesturing for Thomas to take point. As the group rode out, Thomas looked back once to see Annabeth standing straight and tall on the porch, her figure silhouetted against the light from within the cabin. Something about the image struck him powerfully. Annabeth in his home, waiting for his return. It felt right in a way that both comforted and unsettled him. The pursuit lasted through the night and into the following day. Thomas led the group through a treacherous canyon that cut miles off their journey, bringing them to Blackfoot Pass well ahead of the rustlers. There they set up an ambush, waiting in the shadows of the rocky terrain for the thieves to appear. When they did 5 hard-looking men driving the stolen cattle, the ensuing firefight was brief but intense. 2 of the rustlers were wounded, the others surrendered, and miraculously, none of Campbell's party was seriously hurt, though one of the ranch hands took a bullet graze to his arm. By late afternoon, they were driving the recovered cattle back toward Campbell's ranch, the captured rustlers bound and riding under guard. Thomas found himself riding alongside Frank Campbell, who had been quiet since the confrontation. I owe you my thanks, Campbell said finally. Your knowledge of that shortcut made all the difference, Thomas shrugged. I was glad to help. Rustlers are everyone's problem out here. Campbell nodded, then added, I've noticed my niece has been spending a good deal of time at your place these past weeks. Thomas tensed, unsure how to respond. He settled for the truth. She has. I've enjoyed her company. Campbell studied him for a long moment. Annabeth has had more than her share of sorrow in life. Losing her husband so young, then her parents within a year of each other, and finally her brother to influenza last winter. She told me about her husband, Thomas said. Not the rest, she wouldn't. Annabeth doesn't dwell on her troubles. Campbell coughed, a harsh sound that spoke of his failing health. She deserves some happiness, Thomas, and from what I've seen, you're a good man. Just be certain of your intentions before you go any further. I respect her too much to trifle with her, Thomas said firmly. Good, Campbell replied, because while I may be old and sick, I can still shoot straight enough to make any man regret hurting my niece. The threat was delivered with a hint of humor, but Thomas didn't doubt its sincerity. Understood, he said simply. It was well after dark when they reached Campbell's ranch. Annabeth was there waiting, having ridden over earlier in the day when it became clear they had been successful. She helped tend to the wounded, organized food for the tired men, and generally took charge of the situation with a quiet efficiency that impressed everyone, including her uncle. When it was time for Thomas to return to his own ranch, Annabeth walked him to his horse. "Thank you for going with them," she said softly. "Uncle told me how you led them through that canyon. He said they wouldn't have caught the rustlers without you." Thomas shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "Anyone would have done the same." "No, they wouldn't have," Annabeth insisted. "And you know it." She hesitated, then asked, "Will you come to dinner tomorrow? Uncle wants to thank you properly." Thomas smiled, thinking of his conversation with Campbell. "I'd be honored." As he rode home through the moonlit night, Thomas felt a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. The danger and action of the past 24 hours had awakened something in him, a reminder of his own strength and capability that grief had buried. And beyond that was the growing certainty of his feelings for Annabeth, feelings that could no longer be denied or ignored. At Tucker's Rest, his first stop was Abigail's grave. The wildflowers Annabeth had planted were beginning to sprout, tiny green shoots reaching toward the summer sky. "I think I'm falling in love again, Abby," he said softly, touching the wooden cross. "I didn't expect it, didn't want it even. But it's happening all the same." He sighed, looking up at the star-filled sky. "I'll always love you. You were my first love, my wife, the woman who made me a better man. Nothing can change that. But Annabeth, she's helping me find my way back to life. I think you would like her, Abby. She's strong and kind like you were, different but with that same light inside." For the first time since Abigail's death, Thomas slept in their bed that night, wrapped in the quilt she had made, and his dreams were peaceful. The dinner at Campbell's ranch the following evening was a festive affair. Frank Campbell had invited all the men who had participated in the recovery of his cattle, as well as neighboring ranchers and their families. It was partly a celebration of their success, and partly a warning to other would-be rustlers that the community stood united against theft. Thomas arrived early, freshly shaven and wearing his best shirt. Annabeth met him at the door, looking lovely in a simple dress of deep green that matched her eyes. "You clean up nicely, Mr. Tucker," she said with a smile. "As do you, Miss Stewart," he replied, offering her the small bouquet of wildflowers he had gathered from the riverside that morning. Annabeth's eyes softened as she accepted the flowers. "They're beautiful, Thomas, thank you." The evening was enjoyable, with good food, music from a fiddler who had ridden in from town, and the satisfaction of a community coming together. Thomas noticed that Frank Campbell seemed to take particular pleasure in seeing him and Annabeth together, often directing the conversation to include them both or finding reasons for them to work together on serving the meal or clearing the tables afterward. Later, as people began to leave and the gathering wound down, Campbell called Thomas into his study, a book-lined room that reflected the older man's education and interests. "I wanted to show you something," Campbell said, opening a drawer in his desk and removing a worn leather portfolio. "These are the original survey maps of this valley, made when I first came out here 20 years ago." Thomas examined the maps with interest. They were detailed and beautifully drawn, showing not only Campbell's large ranch but the surrounding area, including what would later become Tucker's Rest. "I've been thinking," Campbell continued, "about the future of my ranch. As you know, I have no son to inherit, and while Annabeth is certainly capable, I don't think she wants the responsibility of the entire operation." "She's mentioned as much," Thomas acknowledged. Campbell nodded. "What I'm considering is dividing the property. The main ranch house and the northern pastures would go to Annabeth, while the southern section could be sold or leased to someone who would work it properly." He fixed Thomas with a meaningful look. "Someone like yourself, perhaps." Thomas was taken aback by the suggestion. "That's very generous, Mr. Campbell, but I couldn't possibly afford to buy that much land." "Who said anything about buying?" Campbell replied with a shrewd smile. "I'm talking about a partnership initially. You've proven yourself a skilled rancher and a man of integrity. I'd be willing to lease you the land on favorable terms with an option to buy over time. Thomas's mind raced with the possibilities. The southern section of Campbell's ranch bordered his own property. Combined, they would make a substantial and prosperous operation. It was the kind of opportunity most men in his position could only dream of. "Why me?" he asked finally. Campbell's expression softened. "Because I've seen how you look at my niece and how she looks at you." "Because life is short, Thomas, as I know all too well these days, and because I'd rest easier knowing that Annabeth has someone of your character beside her when I'm gone." Thomas was silent for a long moment. "I'm honored by your trust, sir. But this is something I'd need to discuss with Annabeth first. I wouldn't want her to think I had any ulterior motives." Campbell laughed, a sound that turned into a coughing fit. When he recovered, he said, "That's exactly why I'm offering it to you. Go on, then. She's out on the porch." "Talk to her." Thomas found Annabeth sitting on the porch swing, gazing out at the starlit landscape. She moved over to make room for him, and they sat together in comfortable silence for a few minutes. "Your uncle has made me an extraordinary offer," Thomas said finally, "to lease the South Range." Annabeth asked, surprising him. "He mentioned he was considering it." "You knew?" Annabeth nodded. "Uncle Frank and I have had many conversations about the future of the ranch. It makes sense to divide it. It's too much for one person to manage, especially since I—" She hesitated, then continued, "especially since I've found myself increasingly drawn to another valley entirely." Thomas felt his heart quicken at her words. "Annabeth," he began, turning toward her, "these past weeks with you they've brought me back to life. I never expected to feel this way again after Abigail died. I thought that part of me was buried with her. But you've shown me that the heart can heal, that it's possible to honor what was while still embracing what might be." Annabeth's eyes shone in the moonlight. "And what might be, Thomas?" Thomas took her hand in his. "I care for you deeply, more than I thought possible, and if you feel anything similar, I'd like to court you properly with your uncle's blessing." "Court me," Annabeth repeated, a smile playing at her lips. "That sounds very formal." "I'm not a man who takes such matters lightly," Thomas replied seriously. "You deserve to be honored and respected, Annabeth, not rushed into anything before either of us is ready." Annabeth's expression softened, and she squeezed his hand. "I care for you too, Thomas. More than I've cared for anyone since Jack died, and yes, I would be honored to be courted by you." Her smile turned mischievous. "Though I can't promise to always behave with proper decorum, I've never been very good at following society's rules." Thomas laughed, feeling lighter than he had in months. "I wouldn't want you any other way." In that moment, with the stars shining overhead and the promise of a new beginning between them, Thomas leaned forward and gently kissed Annabeth. It was a tender kiss, full of hope and possibility. When they pulled apart, both were smiling. "I should get home," Thomas said reluctantly. "It's a long ride." "Will you come for Sunday dinner?" Annabeth asked. "Uncle Frank would be pleased, and so would I." "Wild horses couldn't keep me away," Thomas promised. The summer months passed in a golden haze of long days and warm evenings. Thomas and Annabeth's courtship progressed naturally, their connection deepening with each shared conversation, each quiet moment by the river, each challenge faced together. Thomas began working the southern range of Campbell's property, dividing his time between his own ranch and what might one day be an extension of it. Annabeth split her time between her uncle's ranch and Tucker's Rest, often staying for several days at a time in Abigail's sewing room, which Thomas had converted into a guest room for her. The neighbors raised eyebrows at first, but Frank Campbell's approval of the arrangement silenced most gossip. In late August, Frank Campbell's health took a sudden turn for the worse. The doctor from Riverton was summoned, but there was little he could do beyond making the old rancher comfortable. "Pneumonia," he told Thomas and Annabeth privately. "His lungs were already weakened. I'm afraid it's just a matter of time." Annabeth moved back to her uncle's ranch to care for him, and Thomas rode over daily, helping to manage both properties while she focused on nursing Campbell. The old man faded quickly, but his mind remained sharp until the end. One evening, as Thomas sat beside his bed while Annabeth prepared dinner, Campbell beckoned him closer. "I've had the lawyer draw up the papers," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "The South Range will be yours to lease with terms for eventual purchase. The main ranch goes to Annabeth." "Thank you," Thomas said, genuinely moved by the old man's generosity. "I'll make sure it prospers. I know you will." Campbell paused, gathering strength. "But that's not what matters most. Take care of her, Thomas. She's stronger than she looks, but she's known too much loss." "I'll spend my life making her happy," Thomas promised, "if she'll have me." A ghost of a smile crossed Campbell's pale face. "She will. She's as stubborn as her mother was, and once she sets her heart on something." He trailed off, his eyes drifting closed. Frank Campbell passed peacefully in his sleep that night, with Annabeth holding his hand and Thomas standing vigil nearby. They buried him 2 days later in the small cemetery near Riverton, with nearly everyone from the surrounding ranches in attendance. Frank had been well respected, a pioneer who had helped establish the community and who had always dealt fairly with his neighbors. After the funeral, as the mourners dispersed, Thomas and Annabeth stood alone by the fresh grave. Annabeth's grief was quiet but deep, another loss in a life that had seen too many. "What will you do now?" Thomas asked gently. Annabeth looked out over the rolling landscape, the mountains blue in the distance. "Honor his wishes, try to keep the ranch going." She turned to Thomas. "But I don't want to live there alone, Thomas. It's too big, too empty without him." Thomas took her hand. "Then don't," he said simply. "Marry me, Annabeth, not because of the ranch or the land, but because I love you. Because you've brought spring back to my heart when I thought winter would last forever." Annabeth's eyes widened at his unexpected proposal. "Thomas, I know it's sudden," he continued, "and if you need time, I understand, but I've been thinking about this for weeks. I love you, Annabeth Stewart. I want to build a life with you, to face whatever comes together." Tears filled Annabeth's green eyes, but she was smiling. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you, Thomas Tucker. Because I love you too, and because life is too short and too precious to waste a moment of it." Thomas pulled her into his arms, holding her close as if afraid she might disappear. When they finally stepped apart, both were smiling through tears. "When?" Thomas asked. "I don't want to rush you, especially so soon after your uncle's passing." Annabeth considered. "A month," she decided. "Time enough to arrange things properly, but not so long that we're waiting needlessly. Uncle Frank wouldn't want us to postpone happiness on his account." They were married in early October, as the aspen trees turned golden on the mountainsides. The ceremony was held at Tucker's Rest, with the minister from Riverton officiating and neighbors from throughout the valley in attendance. Annabeth wore a simple dress of ivory silk, ordered from Denver, and carried a bouquet of late wildflowers. Thomas, in a new suit that felt strangely restrictive after years of work clothes, thought she had never looked more beautiful. After the celebration, when the last guests had departed and they were finally alone, Thomas took Annabeth's hand and led her to the riverside. There, beside Abigail's grave, now covered in a blanket of wildflowers from the seeds Annabeth had planted, they stood in the fading light. "I wanted to come here first," Thomas said quietly, "to acknowledge the past while embracing our future." Annabeth nodded in understanding, squeezing his hand. "She'll always be part of you, Thomas, as Jack will always be part of me. They shaped us, loved us, and helped make us who we are." Thomas turned to face his new wife, taking both her hands in his. "But today begins our story, yours and mine together, and I'm grateful beyond words for this second chance at love." "As am I," Annabeth replied, her eyes shining with happiness. "Now take me home, husband." "We are home," Thomas said simply, drawing her into his arms as the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, a promise of beauty yet to come. The years that followed were good ones for Thomas and Annabeth. They combined their properties, creating one of the most prosperous ranches in the valley. The South Range that had once belonged to Frank Campbell proved especially good for breeding horses, which became their specialty. Annabeth's eye for horseflesh and Thomas's skill at training produced animals sought after throughout the territory. They built a new, larger cabin at Tucker's Rest, incorporating parts of the original structure that Thomas and Abigail had built, a tangible connection to the past that felt right to both of them. The old cabin became a guest house, often filled with friends or business associates who came to purchase horses or cattle. In the spring of their second year of marriage, Annabeth gave birth to a daughter, whom they named Frances Abigail Tucker, honoring both Frank Campbell and Thomas's first wife. The child had Thomas's dark hair and Annabeth's green eyes, a perfect blending of them both. 2 years later, a son joined their family, Jack Thomas Tucker, named for Annabeth's first husband and his father. Through all the changes and growth, Thomas maintained his evening ritual of visiting Abigail's grave, though now it was often with Annabeth and their children beside him. They planted new flowers each spring, and Thomas made sure the children knew about the woman who had helped make their home possible. "She would have loved you both," he would tell them as they placed wildflowers on her grave, "and she would have been so happy to see this ranch thriving." One evening, as they sat on the porch of their home watching their children play in the yard, Annabeth turned to Thomas with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, "taking a chance on love again after losing Abigail?" Thomas considered the question, watching as Frances chased her younger brother through the golden evening light. "No," he said finally. "Grief nearly buried me alongside her. I thought my life was over." He took Annabeth's hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "But you helped me believe in spring again, in the possibility of new beginnings. How could I regret that?" Annabeth smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "When Jack died, I thought I'd never find that kind of love again. I'm glad I was wrong." "As am I," Thomas replied, kissing the top of her head. "As am I." The sun sank behind the mountains, casting long shadows across Tucker's Rest, but Thomas Tucker wasn't afraid of the darkness. He had learned that night always gave way to dawn, that winter inevitably yielded to spring, and that the heart, even one broken by loss, had an astonishing capacity to heal, to grow, and to love again. Beside the river, where he had once buried his wife in grief, wildflowers now bloomed in profusion, a living testament to the enduring power of love and the promise of renewal that came with each new day.